Making grappa is the reason why we at Blackwood Spirits decided to try our hand at distilling. We quickly realized that it's a labor-intensive and lengthy process. It's also seasonal, which is why for most of the year we make our excellent gins. Grappa is grape husk spirit, and technically we should call it that, given that only when it's made in Italy can it carry the name grappa. However, as grape husk spirit is such a lengthy term, for the sake of this video we shall keep calling it grappa. Our production process is also slightly different compared to that used in Italy, simply because we are a small distillery and we cannot handle the volumes that Italian producers can handle. To make wine, grapes are pressed to extract a sweet liquid. This is then fermented. What remains, the grape husks or pomace, is used to make grappa. Even after these grape bunches have been pressed, there is sufficient liquid and more importantly sufficient sugar left in these grapes for it to be fermentable and hence distillable. We source our grape husks from a nearby sparkling wine producer, and there are the classic varieties used for that. The white Chardonnay and the red Pinot Noir grapes. At a high level, our process is simple. We ferment the pomace and then distill it in a copper still similar to this one. We double distill our grappa. That is, we first perform what is called a stripping run, namely extract the alcohol from the pomace and then redistill it again. This improves the quality of the product. The distillation process in both cases is slightly different. As mentioned, grappa is seasonal. You only get the grapes at harvest time, and even then you're not quite sure exactly what day you're going to get the grapes. You just have to be ready for it. Let's see how this whole process works. Cheers! The first step is picking up the grapes. They are transported in big bins, which are used later for the fermentation stage. The grapes we receive from the winemaker are not destemmed, they are just lightly crushed. So we need to destem them first before we can ferment anything. And for that, we use a destemmer, a machine like this. The grapes go in at the top. And once the machine runs, the actual destemmed grapes come out at the bottom there, and the stems come out here. It's a noisy machine, so let's see it in action. Once destemmed, the grape husks go back into a barrel. We add some water to increase the volume of liquid and then add yeast to start the fermentation. Yeast converts the sugars into alcohol, releasing carbon dioxide during that process. To make sure all the sugars are converted into alcohol, one periodically has to mix up the contents of each barrel. This is called punching the cap. As time marches on and the fermentation slows down, you do this less often than in earlier stages. How do we know the fermentation is slowing down? Remember the carbon dioxide byproduct I mentioned? That needs to be released, and this is done through an airlock or bubbler. That's the contraption on top of the barrel. It allows the carbon dioxide to escape while preventing air from coming in. Air contains oxygen, which oxidizes the fruit and can ruin absolutely everything. During the initial stages, fermentation is quite vigorous, and you definitely know when it's happening. Eventually the bubbling slows down and stops, and the fermentation is complete. We allow our fruit to ferment for quite some time before we consider it ready for distillation. When fermentation is completed, it is time to distill. As we use an open gas flame with our Portuguese copper still, we do it outside on this table. The black bins below the table are water tanks or a condenser. As we cannot leave the still outside all the time, we need to assemble it for each distillation run and disassemble it afterwards when it has cooled down. The gas burner produces a lot of heat, and we managed to scorch the top of the wooden table in the past, so now we protect it using a few protective plates, a heat-resistant silicone mat and some metal disc on which the burner stands. This allows the heat to dissipate better. Let's speed this up a bit. The gas burner, a windshield, the pot, 20 kilos of pomace and some tails from the previous run. The column extender with another 3 kilos of pomace. The still head. Now we assemble the condenser, a stand and the condenser itself to which we attach the water supply. The neck that connects the still to the condenser. Power supply for the condenser water pump. We add some temperature sensing electronics. Temperature is one of the key pieces of information to keep track of when distilling. We built our own hardware and software for this. It's unfortunately a bit fiddly to connect it all. Now we seal the gaps between the pot, the column extension and the head using the age-old method of rye paste. As the still heats up, the paste bakes and forms a perfect seal. It's cheap and works like a charm. Final touches include a work table and our temperature sensing display. Now it's time to turn on the gas, light the fire and start the actual distillation run. It takes about an hour before the first drops of distillate come out, so let's see what's actually happening inside the still. Inside the pot we added a perforated copper plate, which prevents the pomace from touching the bottom of the pot as it may otherwise scorch and impart an unpleasant flavour. The liquid can obviously trickle down. The column extension also has a perforated bottom, thus keeping the pomace within it while the liquid drops into the pot. The flame underneath the pot slowly heats up the liquid, most of which is water but contains alcohol. This evaporates before the water and the alcohol gas rises up the pot, heating up any alcohol still contained within the grapes and carrying with it flavour elements. As the temperature increases, the alcohol gas continues rising through the column extension, collecting more alcohol and flavour. Once the gas enters the neck, it reaches the point of no return. As it drops in temperature, it starts condensing and flows downwards into the coil within the condenser. Cold water circulates from the condenser to the bins under the table mentioned earlier, and as the gas cools, it turns back into liquid. In essence, what has happened is that water with a bit of alcohol has been converted into alcohol with a bit of water. At the early stages of a run, the alcohol level in the distillate is over 80%, but this drops as the run continues. The first drops of any run are always exciting. You can smell it before it happens, and then, suddenly, it begins. The first 100 milliliters we throw out. These are the 4 shots and contain methanol and unpleasant flavors. They should never be collected. As mentioned before, we double distill our grappa. The aim of the first distillation is to strip as much alcohol as possible from the pomace. This takes a few hours and results in about 3.5 liters of alcohol. This is the heart of the run, and we stop collecting it when the alcohol percentage drops to about 55%. We then collect some tails for the next run, stopping when we reach about 40%. There is not much to do during these hours but to stop collecting beakers and watching the bubbles, which look great in slow motion. With a small still and 6 barrels of fermented pomace, it took us over 20 runs for the first distillation for each of the 2 grape varieties. After the first set of distillation runs, we let the liquid settle in stainless steel tanks for a while before we start with the second distillation. Because there is no pomace involved, the still setup is simpler. For example, there is no neck extension required at all. Inside the pot is 20 liters of liquid, most of which comes from the first distillation runs, cut down with water to about 44% alcohol. As with any distillation run, we toss out the 4 shots, separate the heads and then collect the hearts, which we collect till the alcohol level drops to about 70% alcohol. Any tails that are collected afterwards are used for the subsequent second distillation run. In this way we ensure that the quality of our runs is always very high. Once we collected the second distillation runs, it is again stored in stainless steel tanks for a while, which allows it to settle before we bottle it. Is there a better way to finish a good evening than with a nice espresso, some dark chocolate and our grappa? I don't think so. Cheers.